Next, Garvey looks out the window at the approaching jaybirds and exclaims to Parker, "Yonder they are, the street's full of them. They'll riddle you." Garvey snatches up his Winchester, walks from the courthouse, and stands, waiting in the street. Wade, Mason, and Smith follow. It takes several minutes before the struggling Parker joins them. Just as the initial shots rang out, Texas Ranger Sergeant Aiken is in camp giving quinine to a ranger sick with malaria. He stops what he's doing, leaps into his saddle, and heads for the courthouse. Ranger Smith and Robinson follow. By the time he arrives, Sheriff Garvey and Deputies Mason and Smith are standing in front of the courthouse drawing their Winchesters. Aiken rides up to Garvey and pleads with him to go back into the courthouse and let the Rangers handle this. "Never," Aiken replies Garvey. "I'm sheriff of this county, and I'm going to handle the situation myself. You keep out of it." Aiken then rides up to the Jaybirds and takes hold of Volney Gibson's gun barrel. Volney jerks it away, points it at him, and says, "I don't want to hurt you, Aiken, but you can't take my gun and stop this crowd. We're going to clean them out of the courthouse this time." Aiken says to Gibson, "Don't you know you'd be shooting your own cousin?" And Gibson replies, "Wade stopped being my kin when he became a woodpecker scallywag." Aiken made no moves to stop Frost. Judge John Ballow, who is standing on the sidewalk, calls to Frost to stay where he is, but probably is not heard or is just ignored. Deputy Mason's wife, fearing for her husband's life, rushes up to stop Frost, but is frightened by the terrible look on his face. In any case, it's too late. No one can stop Frost and his agitated jaybirds. Suddenly, the bullets begin whizzing fast and furious around everybody's heads. Aiken remarks, "All hell is puking." When he realizes he can't stop the impending shootout, he calls to his two rangers, "Save yourself, boys, this isn't our fight." He then rides between two buildings and watches the whole thing. The other two rangers are hemmed in between the two groups and are caught directly in the line of fire. This time, the Ranger legend, "one riot, one ranger," doesn't hold true. The only thing the Rangers can do is keep cool and remain neutral on the side of the Jaybirds. Frost and Garvey are now face to face. Frost yells, "Trot out your brave woodpeckers. The cowardly Jaybirds are coming." Someone among the Jaybirds shouts, "They've been assassinating us long enough. We'll kill them as they come." "Come on," the woodpecker yells. "Go on," the Jaybird calls to his flock. Then silence. Then suddenly, trigger snap and muzzles blaze, and as if simultaneously, Garvey and Frost fire point blank at each other, both realizing the end is there for one or both of them. Frost empties 7 bullets into Garvey. Nevertheless, Garvey drags himself up against the hitching post, fires 2 or 3 more shots at Frost, then slumps again and falls dead. Frost is badly wounded. He now has a gaping hole in his stomach, but he crosses the street anyway and hobbles to the corner of Morton and 6th Streets. Yandell Ferris and Calvin Blakely are there. Frost sees the old and infirm ex-treasurer, Woodpecker Jake Blakely, standing near the front of the post office. Ferris, too, sees Blakely, that old woodpecker, and raises his gun to fire at him, but Judge Parker's wife, who had rushed up when the firing began, seizes his arm and begs him not to shoot, saying, "Oh, Yandell, don't you do it. You know it's wrong." But Frost, who had lost his gun, snatches the gun from Ferris's shaking hand and demands, "Give me your gun. I want to kill Blakely." Jaybird Calvin Blakely evidently also thinks of shooting the older Jake Blakely, but lowers his gun and says, "Yes, go on. I can't. He's my uncle." Frost moves down the street, takes dead aim, fires twice, and Blakely falls, mortally wounded. Blakely was unarmed. Colonel P.E. Pearson tries to get Frost to leave the fight and get medical attention, but Frost refuses, saying, "No, let me die. You go on and fight." Then another friend begs Frost to leave the fight, but Frost replies, "I am killed, I am dead, I'm a goner, but I killed Blakely." Blakely had been a woodpecker and had been a leader of the Republican Negro League. According to the Jaybirds, he deserved what he got, death. To bring you up to speed, the woodpeckers have the advantage so far. They are now in the courthouse or behind an iron fence that surrounds it and can fire with telling effect at the Jaybirds who are in the open. There's also a sniper firing at the Jaybirds from an upstairs window in the National Hotel. But there are other developments. 3 young Jaybirds, Earl McFarlane, Dolph and Sid Pearson, perched high above the fray from upstairs in the McFarlane home across the street, take matters into their own hands. Young McFarlane fires a gun from an open north window, striking Judge Parker in the groin his second wound, as he is coming out of the courthouse. Again, groaning and cursing at the jaybirds, Parker drags himself back into the courthouse. When the rest of the woodpeckers realize that the person or persons shooting from that upstairs window can pick them off, they retreat into the courthouse and stay there. Finally, all is quiet, except the groans of the wounded. In a matter of some 20 minutes and several hundred volleys, fired by about 35 cursing and shouting men, it was all over. 4 men had lost their lives and several more were wounded. Morton Street in front of the courthouse, the scene of the battle, was an awful sight. The dead, dying, and wounded lay there in their spilled blood. The Jaybird participants looked at each other, seemingly in a daze, as they viewed the scene. For a time, no one went near the scene of the battle. Everyone stayed secluded behind the closed doors at their homes or in places of business. But soon, the initial shock passed. Next, several men and women rushed into the street to care for the dead and wounded. Mrs. Alex McNabb, daughter of Carrie Nation, goes to the dead Garvey and has her husband and Dudley Bell carry him into the Blakely and Bassett General Mercantile Store. Blakely's body is put on a cot outside the courthouse. Later, the bodies of Blakely and Garvey are taken to Blakely's home on Austin Street. Parker, seriously hurt, and Frost, fatally wounded, are given medical attention. Then Frost drags himself home. Parker, too badly wounded to be moved, remains in the courthouse and is soon joined by his family. Sergeant Aiken jumps from his horse and pulls wounded Ranger Smith into a building and sends for a doctor. Deputies Mason and Wade, Wally Gibson, and Will Andrus, who have minor wounds, are also given medical attention. Richmond had plenty of doctors. Finally, a Negro man, no doubt trembling with fear, goes to the limp body of the fifth victim, Little Roby Smith, and carries her away. The 20-minute battle involving 26 jaybirds and 6 woodpeckers was over. Surprisingly, there were very few casualties considering the number of bullets fired. No blacks had taken part in the battle and continued to be frightened. Richmond remained an armed camp. Soon, news of the battle reached the outside world. Governor Ross received frantic wires from Judge Weston and Sergeant Aiken to send militia. In response, the Houston Light Guard rushed by train from Houston, with the Brenham Grays arriving too. The next day, Saturday, the streets are eerily solemn. Doctors from Houston arrived to attend Henry Red Hot Frost. A 20-minute afternoon shower washes away blood from the sandy street and stained sidewalks. More about the dead. A double funeral service was held for woodpeckers Blakely and Garvey at the Blakely home at 6 p.m. Jaybird Henry Red Hot Frost, attended by Houston physician, dies. Before he died, he requested a monument be erected in memory of the Jaybird Project. You can see it today next to the Richmond City Hall. And finally, a neutral, innocent bystander, Little Roby Smith, is laid to rest. On that same day, the Saturday after the battle, Governor Ross and Attorney General Harrison arrived by train at 7 p.m. to assess the situation and find out what happened. There are several contradictory versions of the battle, and no one can agree who shot first. But regardless of the version, the Jaybirds won the battle of August 16, 1889. No Jaybirds talked about it for a long time after the battle, but in the minds of many, nothing was really settled. The feud lived on. As time passed, several tales evolved regarding the feud, and for a period of time, siding with the victorious Jaybirds was required. Judge Finn told this story. A noted Brazoria wag came to Richmond when feelings were high. A partisan immediately approached him with the question, "Are you a Jaybird or a woodpecker?" The wag, not knowing the questioner's affiliation, finally replied, "I don't belong to either party. I'm a mockingbird, and I'll sing you any tune you wish." My favorite is one told later by Ira Aiken, the young ranger, and his tale goes like this. A farmer had just moved to Fort Bend County. This inoffensive newcomer had no desire to take sides. He simply wanted to till the fertile Brazos bottom and have a reasonable chance to reach a ripe old age in peace. He was plowing his field one day. In reaching the end of the road, 10 men armed with Winchesters and 6-shooters rode out of the woods. The leader asked, "Are you a Jaybird or a woodpecker?" The terrified farmer was between a rock and a hard place. Scholars would have said he was in a quandary. He did not know whether his formidable and unwelcome visitors were Jaybirds or woodpeckers. From their looks, he might well believe that a wrong answer could be fatal. After thinking it over carefully, he replied, "Well, gentlemen, I guess I am a Jaypecker. But enough of the legend. Here's how the rest of the events unfolded. The presence of the Texas Rangers and the late arrival of the Houston Light Guards and the Brenham Grays put the quietus on any possibility of the feud continuing. Governor Ross arrived on Saturday night and mediated the outcome before he left on Tuesday. Ranger Ira Ayton stayed on as sheriff, maintained the peace, and assisted Judge Weston in restoring county government. Subsequently, the Democrats were able to take control of the government, and the Jaybirds looked for ways to perpetuate that control, so they created a new organization called the Jaybird Democratic Association of Fort Bend County. Their constitution created what was called a white man's union that overwhelmingly dominated Fort Bend politics for more than 6 decades. The Republican Party in Fort Bend County was now all but non-existent, leading the way for the Jaybirds to do their thing. They arranged it so that all county-level Democrat candidates, the Jaybirds did, arranged it that the Democrat candidates had to be approved by the Jaybird Democratic Association before they could get on the Democrat ticket. This ensured that no blacks or other minorities or undesirable whites could get elected. This lasted until the early 1950s. Willie Melton, the well-to-do black farmer from Kendleton, dreamed of ending this nightmare for blacks in Fort Bend County. He was friends and got advice from state NAACP members, which included a young lawyer, Thurgood Marshall. Melton, with the help of Sid Hilliard, a prominent Harris County NAAC member, and Arizona Fleming, a black Richmond businesswoman, began to see his dream fulfilled. On March 16, 1950, they convinced several Fort Bend black voters to be named as plaintiffs against the executive committee of the Jaybird Association. The plaintiffs were John Terry, Jesse Byers, Charlie Roberts, R.E. Pink Jr., and Price Jackson Jr. The 4 Jaybird defendants were A.J. Adams, Mrs. Mattie Schultz, George Lane, and R.M. Darst. The defendants were served with the citations on March 27, 1950. The Texas Coaster, reporting the meeting, clearly indicates the Jaybirds are not going to roll over and die without a struggle. Judge Pearson, attorney for the Jaybirds, retained the firms of Towns and Towns of Houston to represent the Jaybirds because no Fort Bend County attorneys had federal court experience. At the next meeting of the Fort Bend Bar Association, the bar voted to provide no-fee services to the Jaybird Association, but no lawyers other than D.R. Pearson and George Roan actually rendered any legal service or appeared at any of the court hearings. After Judge Kennerly of the U.S. 5th District Court in Houston ruled that the Jaybird Association was indeed a political party and the plaintiffs were legally entitled to vote in the Jaybird primary, Judge Pearson made a motion in the Jaybird Executive Committee to go ahead and hold the May 6 primary and open the primary to Negroes. At first, some committeemen objected, claiming the motion broke faith with the Jaybirds who died for honest, decent county government, that they were custodians of the torch of truth lit in the Jaybird-Woodpecker battle. But cooler heads prevailed. George Roan urged the primary be held as scheduled because candidates were ready to have the races decided. His influence led the Jaybirds deciding that at that time, no further fight would be put up. If the people wanted to abolish the Jaybird primaries, it could be decided in the following primary 2 years later. Yet the legal battle continued. After years of litigation, it finally ended on May 4, 1953, when the Supreme Court of the United States handed down a decision. The argument against the Jaybird organization was that it was illegal, but the court found that the Jaybird Association was indeed legal, and on top of that, the court did not deny it the right to hold primaries. Yet the Jaybird Association lost on its white supremacy tenet. The court ruled the Jaybird Association was indeed a political party, that it came within the scope of the 15th Amendment, and because of this, it could no longer exclude blacks and others from primaries. As it turns out, the Kendleton Heritage Society dedicated a historical marker commemorating this famous case in August 2011 at the Powell Point School Gym. But back to the Jaybird Association. Since the Supreme Court recognized its existence, the Jaybird Association continued to function in county politics for a couple of more decades. Stripped, however, of its original intent to secure a white man's union, and now more involved in seeking a black vote, its members started asking, well, why the Jaybird? Finally, on October 15, 1959, the association voted not to dissolve but simply recess. There were no more meetings, yet a bank account remained. In 1970, the account had grown to $1,593.80. Judge Gates authorized its closeout. The proceeds were presented to the Fort Bend County Museum Association without restriction. But quickly, whatever happened to the jaybirds and woodpeckers who fought in the streets back in 1889? Was justice ever served? As it turned out, the jaybirds and woodpeckers were not quite ready to close the pages of their feud and call it quits. They took it to the courts to answer for their mutual past behavior. The jaybirds demanded the district attorney file suit and recover money due to county for the corrupt woodpecker officials. More spectacularly, the woodpeckers instigated the, quote, infamous Christmas Eve incident, which, when hundreds of jaybirds were herded into trains and sent to Galveston and held in custody of the Galveston sheriff. They were to be tried for interfering with the 1888 congressional election. The jaybirds viewed this incident as spiteful and mean on the part of the woodpeckers, binding them closer together in their righteous cause. Remember that Kyle Terry had shot Ed Gibson in Wharton? Well, the trial was about to take place in Galveston on January 21, 1890, when everything let loose on the stairway of the courthouse. It just so happened that a preliminary hearing was about to take place on the shooting of little Roby Smith by the assailant, Judge Parker. This hearing was to follow that of Texas versus Terry, the Texas versus Terry case over the murder of Ned Gibson. A number of jaybirds were to appear as witnesses in both cases. Involving Gibson was one of them. Sensing trouble, Gibson specifically asked the Galveston County Sheriff to prevent his meeting with Terry. Terry felt uneasy too, but the sheriff denied his request for protection. As it turns out, the sheriff had planned to keep the two men apart, but just as he was about to lead the jaybirds to a separate place in the courthouse, he stepped into his office to sign some papers. At this moment, Terry entered the courthouse. He began to mount the steps to the second floor when Baldy Gibson, standing with the rest of the jaybirds, waiting for the sheriff to return, seized Kyle Terry. On the third step, their eyes met. Gibson drew his Colt .45 and shot Terry through the heart, killing him. Baldy Gibson died before a trial was ever called for the murder of Terry. And Judge Parker, the accused killer of little Roby Smith, died too before his trial. The memories lingered on, but all the bloodletting and spiteful actions were over. Fort Bend County finally settled down to violent-free politics, and for some 69 years, practiced politics jaybird style. In closing, I would like to ask, how does this story challenge us today? We may have found the story interesting, informative, and even entertaining, but what can we learn? None of us have to look very far to find heated issues among nations, religions, political parties, and even on a personal level, among family members, co-workers, and friends. Our conflicts may not end up in a violent street shootout like the jaybirds and woodpeckers, but if we're human, we sometimes find ourselves in another kind of shootout with, say, our spouses, or children, or other people, perhaps assassinating their character with lies, rumors, and gossip. I think the challenge, if we choose to accept it, is to transcend our differences and find a courageous way to creatively reconcile with our opponents and make peace that both sides can be happy with. You've been a great audience. Thank you.